Welcome to Literature in the Making, a reading and conversation event with the novelists Sushil and Timilehin Alake. My name is Matthias Göritz. I'm a novelist, poet, and translator, and I teach as professor of practice in comparative literature at Washington University in St. Louis, and I have the pleasure to briefly introduce our guest speakers today. Sushil is a bilingual writer and translator from India. He has translated Nobel laureate V.S. Naipaul and Amitava Kumar. Two of his writings are part of the academic syllabus at Aarhus University in Denmark. Sushil has received his MPhil and master's degree from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He's a former social media editor and journalist with BBC World Service, and also a PhD fellow for track of international writers at the Washington University in St. Louis. Timilehin Alake grew up in Lagos, in Nigeria. He's a fiction writer at the International Writers Track, working on a debut novel. He is also an associate editor for the Iron Horse literary magazine, and some of his works can be found at Kalahari Review and Contrary magazine. Both of our guests today are working on their first novels, which is always exciting, since here authors are creating their fictional world and speak in their voices for their first time. Sushil's book in the making, the novel Yellow Cake, is an attempt to write about the lives of industrial workers of India in the post-independence era, a time of nation building where the first Prime Minister of India, Nehru, termed the new industrial marvels such as dams and factories as the new pilgrimages. Timilehin Alake's first novel manuscript introduces us to a universe of interconnected stories structured around the fate of what is commonly known as spirit children in Nigeria and across many African traditions. Both projects deal with questions of identity and post-colonial poetics, and I'm very curious to see how both authors will engage with each other's work. Before we begin, I would like to thank Versopolis and the Festival of Hope for making these events possible, as well as all the numerous individuals who are involved. But since there are two wonderful novels to discuss, let's simply give both of our guests a big round of virtual applause, and without further ado, please join me in welcoming Timilehin Alake and Sushil. Enjoy the conversation and the readings during the next 55 minutes.
Thank you, Matthias. And I would like to thank first the Versopolis, which has given us a chance to speak about our novels. And we will discuss about our novels. But let me first ask Timilehin to read some excerpt from his novel and let us a little bit more about generic outlook of his novel. Timmy.
Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Versopolis. We really appreciate being here. So I'm going to begin with a brief reading of the beginning of the first part of this project. All right. Gadima knew she did not want the child, but she would travel to Nigeria anyway. It was her twin brother's daughter after all. What would people say? But then again, what do they not already say about her? Anyone who'd pretended to know her, who'd formed conjectures about how heartless she was, wouldn't resign saying those things about her now. The morning her uncle, Tobe, had called to give her the news of her twin brother's death in the fire, her legs had grown heavy in bed. It was one of those days she has come to know as angry, where the sun rises gray without a shine, and a cold that is not heavy in the atmosphere gnaws at the walls and floors of the house. They say it is a twin thing, and that morning Gadima knew something had happened to Obialo. She began the day by calling to work sick. She was glad that it was Theresa, the old Black receptionist, who had picked the call. Had it been Anuke Betty, the honest-looking, wrinkle-mouthed Oyibo woman, with her incessant interrogation, she would have had to fake a cold. And the way her body felt that morning, it would not have been able to find the necessary theatrics. Gadima didn't eat. Instead, she sat on the bed and watched the clock on the wall tick, one at a time, heavy-footed in its weary journey. She must have sat for over an hour until the phone finally rang. It startled her. She stared long at the pale white receiver on the charging dock, listening to the harmless yet foreboding song it sang before peaking. She had not used the home phone since Obiala stopped calling, and it had gathered light powdery dust. She felt the powdery lightness under her thumb, and she rubbed against it in a circular motion while she waited for a voice on the other end of the line to emerge from a cloud of static. When the voice finally came, it was womanly. It was a younger uncle, Tobe, crying quietly on the other end of the line. She recognized his voice, its conflicted cadence. They had been born days apart and had grown together. Tobe is a being split in the middle like a kola nut before it is broken, two in spirit, a man in many ways and a woman in more. In the old days, before the Christian religion came, people like Tobe were people seen, acknowledged to a wholeness with a space carved for them in the community, in some villages with reverence, and in some, like Gadima's, with apprehension, but they were named, known. But those days passed, and the coming of Christ only erased the designation in their designation in society, and they were not named anymore, and they soon evolved to wear their conflict on their bodies. It was this familiar conflict Gadima gathered in Tobe's voice, only this time it was laced with sorrow. It is me, Tobe from Nigeria, it said, frail. The fire took the whole neighborhood, Gadima. Obialo is dead. Ineka too. Only Chichi survived the fire, Gadima. He's sobered now, his words failing him. The family says to come for your niece. They say it is your duty. Tobe continued to speak, but Gadima could not hear anymore. The news had dissolved the room around her, and the world slowly collapsed into memory. Gadima had not spoken to her brother in 4 years, and as long as she had waited for him to call, she never once thought it would be news of his death that would break the silence between them. She stared straight into the patterns of the black marble countertop in her kitchen. Thin white swirls curled into each other in galactic reverie, and she followed them to wherever it took her for the moment. It was like darkness sucking her in, and for the moment, she didn't mind that it took her to wherever it led. Tobe kept talking. Gadima, absent of the meaning of sound or smell or being or meaning, began to trace the white swirl with her hands idly. The pattern seemed chaotic. She caught every curl, sickle, and bend as Tobe hummed for far behind, as though a clearing came over her. Suddenly his voice began to emerge. You know, he was saying, Obialo had no business living in that slum when you have a duplex in Ikeja. He helped you, helped build that house. I remember well because I was there with him many times. With this my head, he and I carried the cement and the bricks. We drew water from the well for the builders. Why? So that rats and cockroaches can live inside it? You have not come to the house, yet you never let him live there. He waited for a moment, perhaps to offer her a chance to speak, perhaps to gather the cracked pieces of his voice. You have not come home, he finally said, after the short pause, his voice now fully broken. The statement on the shoulder of the brief silence began to resemble a question, but Gadima didn't have an answer. He helped you to get to this America you have abandoned your home for. You did not come when he married. Not once have you seen your niece. Gadima, what has happened to you? He asked, waiting, becoming angry at Gadima's silence. Good, no problem. Don't talk. He is dead now. Come and bury him. That is all I called you to say. The call dropped and the dead hum of a disconnected tone followed. Gadima set the phone down and continued to follow the white swirls with her fingers. She traced the lion with a sparse mane, a young one. Then she traced the man. The man seemed to be falling, descending straight into a spiral that was on the side of his head. If the spiral were straight enough, Gadima imagined it would make a spear and plunge the man. But if it were a wave, it would make water, water like a river that could collect a drowning man, a river like the one that collected their father on the night they were born. The phone rang again. Gadima picked it and listened. Without saying hello, Tobe continued. You are wicked. His voice pitched in frustration. What is the matter with you? But before he could continue, Gadima cut him off herself this time. Whatever he was about to say, she had heard it many times before. Thank you. So that's where I'm going to stop for now in terms of the reading. So this novel, as explained, is divided into three slightly linked stories. The stories mainly deal with the migration of three Nigerians who are all considered spirit children in their cultures. Their migrant experience in contemplating return, in adapting to American culture, in contemplating their homes, becomes affected by the circumstance of their birth as well as their name. Gadima's story, as I just began to read, Gadima is an outsider in a community, born the girl twin of a pregnancy that has been foretold to be a much coveted son. Gadima's birth marked the 10th in the prophecy, basically, right? And her family is marked by this, the whole of her life is marked by this blame of altering her twin brother's destiny. So she migrates to America, hoping to leave a home that hunts her behind. But when her brother dies, she is forced to face her past again. This story basically confronts the difficulties and complications of home and return for immigrants who move from the global south into the global north. And also to accentuate that sometimes these moves are not basically economic charged. They can sometimes be an escape from cultural responsibilities that may be too heavy to bear. The second story that we will talk about today is narrated by Anabiku, and I'll just be very brief with this one. It's narrated by an Abiku child. We'll try to explain what an Abiku child is as we move along. After the Abiku child moves to the US with her mother. Her mother has had this affliction of an Abiku child, which means she had given birth 3 times to 3 children that had died. And pregnant with our narrator, Duro, she decides to run to America with the pregnancy. This ploy fails because she gives birth mid-air in between Nigeria and America. This is where the story unfolds from. The anxiety of being an undocumented mother alone in the US, raising a child by yourself in isolation becomes the story here. So let me pass it over to Jay so we can hear a bit from his work as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Timmy. I'll talk about the novel, but let me read a little part from the thing. This is the beginning of the novel. It was a perfect Tuesday night when he was playing in front of the house and saw his father emerging out of the white clouds. That was his first memory of his father, Jamuna, and the white clouds. How mesmerizing they were with the majestic expanse of snow. They metamorphosed from the ever-expanding mist to enormous cotton balls with each passing moment. He jumped with joy seeing father in the khaki uniform, carrying clouds on his back, which looked like balloons now. He waved and shouted, "Papa, Papa!" He thought it was magic because he wanted to see his father that day, and mother told him to wait for the father in the front yard. He walked with his tiny faltering steps to the street, seeing the clouds. The white clouds were racing behind Jamna, who was furiously pedaling the second-hand bicycle, wanting to reach home before the clouds could touch him. The invisible moisture in those clouds worried Jamna, who had his face covered with a piece of cloth to avoid the moisture at any cost. He wiped the sweat dripping from his forehead, trying to identify the waving hand from far. He recognized the tiny figure of his son waving at him from the corner of the house where they lived. Annoyance and happiness passed Jamna's face at the same time. Annoyed that the little one was out yet, happy to see him awake. With his hectic schedule in the factory, Jamna was not able to spend enough time with the growing child at home. He left home early in the morning, and by the time he came back after his overtime work, the little one was on the bed again. Tonight, his bundle of joy was awake, but then it was not going to be a good night. The boy had no idea about the white clouds, who was reaching out to touch them, catch them, seeing them as white balloons, but Jamna came in between. He scooped up his son with one hand onto the rickety bicycle, carrying him in his lap, and rushed towards the door. He banged on it thrice with full force. The little one cried. He wanted to catch the balloons, which have turned into a giant milky pillow by now. Jamna banged on the door thrice again. "Open the door, open it fast," he shouted. Imperia opened the door terrified by the bang. Jamna didn't react. He closed the door behind him and put the little one on the bed. He hurriedly started closing all the windows of the tiny one-room house and asked his wife, "Why did you close the door? The baby was outside." "I was cooking. The elder one might have closed it. He was trying to sleep. Did they release the gas today?" Imperia asked. "Why was the baby out?" "It is 10:30 p.m., replied Jamna. "He was not sleeping today. He was missing you and had been asking about you since evening." As Jamna closed all the windows and sealed them with wet clothes, the little one watched him quietly. Then he asked, "Papa, is it going to rain tonight?" "Yes, baby, it will rain." "Then why are you putting wet clothes on the door?" "Just to protect the doors and windows, you know. I don't want the dirty water to get into our house," Jamna explained. The little one got a new idea. "I want to go out and bathe in the rain." Jamna, who had decided not to say no to the baby, agreed to his request with a condition. "If you eat with me and listen to my short story, then you may." The little one agreed, and Jamna began to tell the story of a kind king. By the time the story had finished, the little one had eaten a single piece of mango from his papa's plate and fallen asleep in his mother's lap. Outside, everything was white, the whiteness of death. The deluge of whiteness made the outdoors look ghostly. Jamna could see the foggy mist from the kitchen window as he wet the clothes again and again. It looked like flying ash all over. These clouds had no smell and disappeared into the ground as they touched the ground. Jamna was used to seeing the clouds, and he was worried about the next day when there would be dead animals all around. Street dogs had already stopped barking. If any dogs or goats were left outside, they would be dead by now. He tried to listen to the sounds of the birds, but there was none to be heard that night. The silence pierced his heart as he squeezed the water from one of the cloth pieces. So this is the one part of the novel, but as Matthias has explained earlier, that this novel is an attempt to write the story of the industrial workers of India post-independence. Uh, this is also a kind of coming of the age story, because it's a realization of what the things changed in India after independence. And also, like, the story of the industrial workers have not been written in the fiction. I can say that the story of industrial workers in English fiction from India is missing to an extent. So this is my attempt to write about them, these industries which are not from the big cities of India, and they lie in the mostly in the jungles or like areas like which are neglected. And these are the places which makes India in terms of the infrastructure and in terms of the steel, in terms of copper, in terms of all the minerals. But their story, their struggles, and their like the hazards they face have not been documented in fiction. So this is my attempt to do that story. And as the name suggests, you might guess some things. It is like, it's called Yellow Cake. And with the name, I would like to come back to Timmy. Like, I have named my novel, but I know that you're yet to name your novel, and naming has been an important part in your writing. So would you like to talk about the name and the significance of name in your novel?
Thank you, Sushil. Yeah, I'm quite sentimental about naming this work just yet. Maybe at least until it's done. I think it's about, it's probably because I'm writing about like the destiny of names, right? And I probably don't want to name this work before it's done and let that name lead me to where it's supposed to go, rather than the reverse. So yes, I'm sentimental about that.
Is this a cultural thing at not naming something before it is complete?
Well, yeah, to some extent. For instance, like, the Igbo people, which is Gadima's, where Gadima would have come from if she was a real person, they wait a few months before they name a child. In my culture, you have to wait 7 days before you name your child. So there are variances like that, to do some rites before you name something. My right here is to actually write the work before I name it. But on a more serious note, the naming in the work itself is very significant. The characters the name that the characters take is indicative of how their lives turn out. One of the things I'm trying to do is to bring the idea of naming to its cultural importance in African culture, relative to one's identity and home, especially when these identities are forged elsewhere in the West. So ultimately, these characters are linked to their homes through their names. Either they are given names, which is in the case of Duro, or the names that they've grown, that have grown out of cultural perceptions of them in the case of Gadima. I wanted to see how the relationship between home and names can be more complicated. Duro, for instance, who is a typical Abiku, Duro, the name actually is a typical Abiku name. So if you met someone today and they told you their name is Duro Jaye, there is an indication that this person could have been an Abiku child before, immediately, culturally. In terms of Gadima, a name does not directly indicate she is a twin, um, but she carries the weight of the reputation of the bad twin. So like when you have the two kids and one of them is the bad one and the good one, she is the bad twin. More so because she tainted the brother's destiny. And even though her name declares that, because Gadima means everything will be good or you will be good. So even though her name declares that things will be good or that she will be good, she has no choice because her destiny, being joined to her brother, named her as bad regardless. And her story is a story of one who embraces everything that that they have been defined by, everything that have been said about them, and she owns up to this badness proudly. So that's quite interesting for me in terms of like how I wanted to like portray Gadima. I'll quickly read the parts that kind of explains Gadima's
Please,
image.
please.
Uh,
Please.
um, okay, so Gadima somehow always bore his weight. So his is his brother. And somehow her whole life had been defined by either carrying or shedding this weight, a whole person which she had become. Gadima the spiteful, the fairy, the vindictive, the combative, the morose, the ugly, the selfish, had been justifiably a simple rebuke of tiredness. And it was in this rebuttal and tiredness she waited for him to call her first. And she waited and waited, only so she could say she was sorry. She had never been one to pour water to quench the fire of a fight. That was his role. It had always been. So she waited, and because he did not call, she too never called for 4 years. So Gadima is this character who is so stubborn and so adamant because she's been told so for all her life, right? And she misses her brother so much because they have such a strong bond, but she never calls him just because she has to embody this name that she has been given. And our refusal to continue to live under our brother's shadow, is the center part of like most of this story. And you have a situation of naming in your work as well, which I find almost as interesting as how I'm excited about mine. Jamuna is named after a popular river in India, but he also has a brother, Ganga,
Ganga, yes.
Who is a bigger river, and these two are connected. Then you have his son, who you are not sure if you're going to name him for most part of the novel or not. What is this about? What is this medium of naming work doing in your novel? And more specifically, how is it to write a character that doesn't have a name?
There are twofold things. Like with Jamuna, in India, there are like two big rivers, Ganga and Jamuna. So Ganga is the main river, and Jamuna is considered as a tributary. So in India, we say like you behave the way you have been named. So Jamuna is a character who always play a tributary role to his brothers. Like his eldest brother is like very dominative. The middle brother is also very dominative. So Jamuna is a character which doesn't take very thoughtful decisions or look up to other people to make his own decisions. So that was the character, so a tributary character. But the other character which is not named is a more of a conceptual decision on my part. The idea is like, because the industrial workers of India have not been represented in the fiction the way it should have been, so I see them like a nameless character. So that was the conceptual idea behind not naming. I'm still trying to figure out how to play with that. But let me give you something which will relate to the bigger idea of your novel. So this is like little part where Jamuna is running away from his village, he goes to Calcutta, big city, and then from Calcutta, he's running away. So a little part. Jamna was woken up by the ticket checker on the train. He had no ticket and no idea where he was going. He just said, I don't know where I'm going. It was a local train. The ticket checker was not even bothered to hear what passengers had to say. 5 Anna, ticket checker replied. Jamna gave him the money and asked a fellow passenger, what is the last stop of this train? Tata Nagar, came the reply from a man with a large black mole on the nose. He examined Jamna thoroughly before asking, where are you going? I don't know, maybe Tata Nagar, if I get some work there. So you're looking for work. The man lit his Panama cigarette and took a drag. The mole on his nose twitched. Jamna veered outside, looking at the small dirty pond in the rural areas far from Calcutta. Women walked to those ponds filled with green algae, carrying pots to clean. Children dived and men idly sat on the banks, chatting or waiting to catch the fish in the submerged nets in the water. Hawkers have already boarded the train with berries, puffed rice, toys, and cheap kurtas to sell. The compartment felt strange with the screams of hawkers and passengers talking to each other, mixed with the rattling of the iron wheels. There is no rhythm in this train. Jamna thought of the trams of Calcutta, which had a rhyming in their movement. Staring outside the window, he saw the board of the next station. A crackling voice on a public announcement system informed, welcome to Kharagpur. Please change trains here for Asansol and Bhubaneswar. The man with the mole on the nose, engrossed in reading a newspaper, folded the paper and spoke to no one in particular. Do you know, Kharagpur station has the longest railway platform in the world. Jamna heard him, but without replying, ordered jhalmuri and tea from the hawker and then asked the man, you want tea? Oh, yes. The mole again twitched on the nose when the man slurped his tea with relish. From here onwards, we are entering into the industrial belt. There are many industrial settlements. You can find work in any of those. Tata Nagar has the steel plant, but without reference, it will be difficult to get work. What are the other places? Well, you can get down at Ghatchila, where a copper mine is upcoming. Musabani is another place where the train doesn't go. You have to take a bus, or you can get down at Krakha mines. Few mines are coming up there as well. One is of silica, other I don't know. You can get some work there. Finishing his tea in a big gulp, he threw the earthen cup out of the window. So here, the rural India, the earthen cup is going out of the window and the industry is coming. So this is kind of internal migration, but I know that in your novel, migration is a big theme. So can you talk about that part a bit?
Yes. I wanted to, I'm sorry, if I could return the question just very quickly, right? So following what you were saying, and this is about his migration as well, right? I just wanted to ask, the migration in my work, obviously, like, is quite different from yours. We're talking about global migration and then internal. In your case, it seems to me that Jamuna's journey, and right, we see these train rides that he has, and like, people suggest a place to him, and he just comes off and goes there to work like a wanderer. And this speaks to this kind of spontaneity that he lives by, right? But it also looks like a kind of like a scene or a vehicle of like looking at the map of India, especially the rural area. And I just wanted to follow up and ask, like, what is this wandering for Jamuna do? Like, what is this internal migration do in the novel, especially in terms of like how it leads us to the land of the Aboriginal populations where these industries are, and also where we get the story of the pollution, right?
So in my novel, there are like twofold migration. So once Jamna migrates from his village to a big city, Calcutta, and then from there, when he tries to get a bit of independence from his brothers, he takes a train and just leaves somewhere. And this is how he ends up in the mines, where the story unfolds. And then in the second part, which is like the other part of the novel, is like his son, who migrates from this small town to Delhi, looking for his like work, and then realizes like, oh, there is a problem here. So there is a kind of rootlessness in the young character, which you will also find in the character of Jamna. So there are like, they have spent all their childhood in a village. Jamna spends his childhood in the village, but the adult part of his life in the small town. And the young character is spent his childhood in that industrial area. And when he's young, like he's like 20 years old, he leaves the place to go for a new job. So both of them doesn't feel settled at any of these places. So there is they're rootless in many ways. So which is the reality of the 21st century as well. Like we feel rootless, like which is my country? I even asked that question to me, like whether I'm from Delhi or like I'm from St. Louis or I'm from India, US. So
that's actually very interesting. I mean, because in terms of like when we're thinking about home, right? Which is, I think, what I'm trying to do with migration in my work, where you migrate and then you feel almost homeless in a way, right? You're like in the middle. The home doesn't really feel like home anymore. Wherever it is that you've gone to doesn't feel like, you know, home as well. Um, the, so like I think one thing that I really wanted to do with migration, right, was to present different kinds of immigrants, and peculiar issues that they are confronted with, as they reinvent themselves at different points in their journey. The other part, I think, is to maybe complicate like these conditions extremely by placing the weight of mythology on the shoulders of these characters, right? You know, making them a biku or twin and stuff like that. So I'll tell you a story very quickly. So one time, I think this is where it's this story that almost led me to this novel in a sense. 3 years ago, like 4 years ago now, I was in the collections, the African collections wing in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And there were these masks, like a stretch of a corridor of masks. And one of the masks was from my village, my actual village. Yeah. And it said that it was donated by the government of something. That was a lie. There's no way in the world someone has donated, at least I'm skeptical, donated things that are deities that, you know, sacred, things that people have conversations with, people engage with, they worship, to have been donated. And I think that was where I began to think of, you know, just seeing these artifacts or these deities in the presence of that space, behind clear polished glass, you know, line after line of them in a corridor. It felt like a corridor of caged gods. Honestly, it was really sad. And I think it was in that moment I began to contemplate like this idea of, you know, what really mean, what does it really mean to be so far away from home, right? To the point where the things that make you become so irrelevant, right? These gods are just there, and like, you know, they're like things for people to see. So I think that was kind of like the question I'm trying to like answer with these spirit children, who are also considered a sort of deity in our culture. I think it was a way to like bring that feeling to the surface in terms of reflecting on what is lost as well as what is gained when one migrates. So that's kind of like the work migration is doing here. In other words,
I just wanted to add one of the beautiful sentences you said yesterday. Like, you know, you said something like, you know, my characters like Duru and Yewande, they are haunted by home. I just love that phrase you said.
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those haunting, right? Like there are gods who are removed from their home, who have migrated to maybe relinquish this this stature of the divine, but that doesn't leave them alone, right? So it's an interesting part.
With the divinity and masks and like this whole spiritual and the mysticity of the way you talk about your novel, like this is so fascinating. And this takes me to this idea of Abiku phenomenon. I know that because we have talked a lot about it, but I'd like you to explain that Abiku phenomenon a bit. Because I think that's such an interesting idea you have.
Yeah, the Abiku phenomenon is like very central to this work. It's also very popular in African literature. Soyinka, J.P. Clark, a host of people have written poems and books and stuff about it. Yeah, I'm sorry I haven't explained the Abiku up until this point. To put it briefly, an Abiku child is a spirit that dwells in a nether world where children never grow old. And these children live in this colorful and endless celebrations. So it's very Peter Pan Neverland-like in a way. But this Peter Pan story gets like really dark because Abikus they're not malicious. They're not malicious in their own nature, but they're malicious in when they enter into our world. So what they do is they possess a pregnant woman to enter our world, and then their entry into the world is initiated by birth. But the caveat is their exit is also facilitated by death. So they have to die to go back to their actual world. And even worse, they become attached to this mother. So this mother has to repeatedly give birth and lose this child over and over again, which can be devastating for the family. So the Abiku is a kind of like a feared kind of deity in the Yoruba culture. So Duro is the central, like, the central idea of the Abiku for me. The Duro, the name actually means stay, like a plea. And like many second generation immigrant children, this character who is in the middle of many things, the spirit world and the living world, um, Duro was actually born mid-air in between two nations as
I
well.
remember. I remember. You
Right?
told us that.
So
Yeah.
Duro is born in, is born mid-air in the vertical and horizontal between spaces. Duro lives between two worlds. Duro lives between the life of the death and the living. Duro can wield death and life as well as a child. So this feel, I think I kind of like exaggerate this into the feeling of liminality, right? So which produces anxieties, not for Duro herself, as she tries to like find an identity, especially since she's also conscious of being this child who lives between several worlds as well. So in terms of thinking about this world, we could think of like, American culture and like African culture. We can think of a physical world and otherwise. But the anxiety also shows in the mother as well, right? In raising Duro, she lives under the constant fear of the child that is destined to die at any time. And this anxiety mirrors very slightly the anxiety that immigrant parents raising second generation children in the US or somewhere else in the West fear in terms of how these children can grow to be alien from their culture. And that can be scary. And so this is an interesting element to the work, right? And talking about interesting elements, Milan, um, who is the nameless protagonist, I think I reviewed that too quickly, is one that intrigues me in some ways. Life in the city for him feels empty and without magic, which is the link that I'm making here, the spiritual sense. And he misses the rural town and he feels very restless because he needs to return to this magical place. And this is where we get that dichotomy of like, civilization and the local lands, as well as, what has been done to these local lands as well in terms of neglect and pollution. Could you talk about that a little bit? I think it's a pretty interesting part of the work.
The character of Milan, or like the a nameless character, is like I think very close to me, and because it's a character who's like doesn't know where he's going actually. So he doesn't want to live in the city. He doesn't want to go back into in the industrial town because he had problems with his parents. So as I said, like it's a coming of age story as well. But he's in love with that place. The place about which he's slowly learning that there is something going on here, and he's trying to make sense of those small things which he has seen as a child and trying to relate to the larger picture which the knowledge he's getting now. So he thinks, like as the Faulkner has said, the past is not the past, it's always alive. So I'll just read something from the second part of the novel, which is in a first person account. So here it goes. I was born without any complications, but as it happened in that land of magic, complication came sooner than later. I had started walking at that point and suddenly had rashes on my legs. My mother tells me that it just came after the first rain in the month of July and spread on the body like a plague. Soon I had rashes all over my body, including my head full of long locks. I cried all day long, scratching my head and legs. My groin was spared. No rashes there yet, but I mention my groin for a reason. The rashes then took a severe turn and they started forming some kind of a colony on my body. If I visualize them now, they felt like an amoeba expanding its body and becoming an animal with several patches of faces all over my legs, my hands, and head. My head was full of boils and I had a running nose all the time. In 3 or 4 months, my legs were in a situation that pus from my wounds dripped down when I walked. I scratched my hands, head, and cried incessantly. I refused to drink milk and kept quiet when my head was not itching. My mother was worried, but everyone living in the block thought that such skin diseases are okay, as it happened to most of the babies of my age. Jaspal uncle's wife suggested some ointment, and then every friend of Imperia had some advice or a medicine to offer for my misery. I became the site of an experiment, and it went on for months and months and months. So this is a small incident in the life of the young baby, and when he's narrating the story to his wife, and these are the incident which he's trying to relate with the larger problem of pollution that area has. So like the second part of the novel works in these chunks of political events of India. And then with the chunks, like he's becoming friends with the Aboriginal, the native population of that part, and realizing that things are not normal, but he doesn't want to recognize that, oh, this is a problem. He's like trying to avoid these things, like, no, I don't want to say this, like this is not a problem. So he has like friends with the genetic deformities, but he doesn't want to recognize. But when it comes to the city, and he's working as a journalist, he's like, oh, there is something. So in the third part, he goes back to confront these demons that I call. So this is how the novel progresses. So from
Something
here,
that you, I'm sorry to cut you.
Please carry on. No, please carry on.
Something that you mentioned, the image, right? The image of like the colony of one's body, like, someone's body being colonized. I just thought that was like so powerful, right? And it looks like, these, especially since these, the deformations of these children and like, the sickness has been brought upon by the industry, civilization in a sense, right? And that is just really striking how that opens up the story and like, gets it to a very important place. Yeah, a very striking reading. Thank you.
Just because, like, the strange thing is, like, the word colony has so many connotations. Like, if you become a scholar, colony is like colony of West and like that, American colonies or British colonies. But where I grew up, the industrial town, the residential area was called a colony. So there is a whole bunch of children who grew up in colonies. So if I talk to some of my friends who are from some other industrial colony, so they'll say, oh, I also lived in a colony. So oh, I also lived in a colony. So this colony in India has a different altogether one kind of a notion. We like, I just joke around with my friends, like we are children of colony. And then like someone from Delhi who had no idea of this kind of colony is like, oh, really? This is like, there's something going on here.
And I like the way that, the colony or colonization is working in this work, right? It's an undertone. We don't speak it with the whole of our mouths anymore because, it's we're supposed to be in the post-colonial age now, right? Or the neo-colonial and so on and so forth. The train has left and we should forget about it. But it stays there, it lingers in its own way. This is really interesting. I think we're almost rounding off, and I was thinking perhaps we could do a little bit more reading.
Please.
As we end. Would you like to pick a passage or should I go first?
You go first.
Okay. So I wanted, like, since we haven't really
let me say one thing. I am not exoticizing, but I love the name of your characters, Gadinma, Duro, Yawande. So I just wanted to say this. Like I love those names actually. If I speak like these names for like twice or thrice, it creates an image which I like. So please carry on now.
Okay, so let's. I'm just going to read from the beginning of the Duro's part, which is the Abiku child, because we haven't really heard from there. And this is the first few pages from that section. So this begins with Duro, who is now 5 years old, and she's beginning to learn that that she's some sort of spirits that are calling her. So basically, the Abiku community, the spirits world, are actually they found her in America and they want to call her back. So the image of being haunted by home again comes in here. The dreams began a few months after we moved out of the basement. It was always the small child under a contorted baobab tree, his face buried into the dirt, singing sonorously about home. At this time, I had just turned 5. Auntie Shalewa's house had been depopulated and she invited us to move into one of the rooms upstairs. The move didn't excite me as much as it had excited Mama, who had become disillusioned with living in the cold, dingy basement. Even though it was always freezing in there, I had grown to love the space. I loved how the wet, cold air licked my skin into an abrasion of goosebumps after my night showers, how our twin-sized bed rested against one end of the wall, while our small TV, tucked underneath a grotesque network of heating system pipes that growled at our intrusion, hung on the other end. The Guturo machinery hummed me to sleep with its threat. There was a mighty dragon in the room, standing guard, protecting me and Mama while we slept. More importantly, it laid the dreams away. The room upstairs, on the other hand, was airy and bright, with most of its walls making 2 large windows, long, colorful drapes patterned with golden, yellow, and lime green wheels dropped like a waterfall over either side of the walls. The drapes, which were supposed to cover things, somehow made me feel exposed. I was going to tell Mama just that when she pulled back the drapes and let the sun in. She lifted her head back, stretched the length of her hands behind her, and closed her eyes like a television model. The room was something good she had, a silver of joy, something that I ought to snatch as my Abiku nature demanded. I could not tell Mama how much I hated the room, perhaps because even more gravely than hate, I could not tell her that I was somehow afraid of the light that poured into the room, that the things inside me rippled back to life, waiting to claim me. So this basically sets up the story. We see also that there's a small progression here from being living in the basement for a few years that is like very bad, a bad condition, to then getting a room, but then that progress is immediately under threat for Duro personally, and in a grand sense, allegorically, for a migrant. The progress is always some sort of a setback in different ways. So yes, would you like to read?
Yes, we are almost like time is up, but I'll read a little bit from the third part, which is like, so please mind, like this is the third part, so there will be some new names, and this is basically the main character is going to meet his native friend. So, and in the industry town, so he's there. They crossed the knee-deep water in the river, pushing the motorcycle. There was no Bhola on the other side waiting for him like the old days. They reached Fudan Majhi's house and found them outside sitting and trying to help a goat in delivering a baby. Bhola came to him and smiled. He smiled back. He wanted to hug him, but Bhola's hands were full of blood and he wore only a piece of cloth on his vest. Fudan Majhi came after a few minutes. Fudan looked at him for a while and said, "You are tall. I still remember you following me and asking me to play the flute. I want to play the flute again. I want you to play the flute again. I came to listen to your flute," he replied and hugged Fudan Majhi. "How's your wife?" Bhola intervened. "Is he married?" Fudan asked Bhola. "Yes, I am. It's been a year now," he said. "Well, she didn't come with you? Is she in colony? Is she afraid of jungles?" Fudan asked. No, she's in Delhi. I came for some work," he said and put down his bag. Bhola's wife came out and brought fruits to eat. Children from other houses came to see the guy from Delhi and looked at him with curiosity. Bhola shooed them and brought hadiya for all. They drank for a while. Fudan took leave in between to do his prayers. So he asked Bhola, "I heard you are marrying again." "He must have told you," Bhola pointed to Vishnu. "Yes, he told me, but is that true?" "Yes, I am marrying again," Bhola said without hesitation. "But why?" "I'm married for more than 5 years. I do not have a child till now. We had 3 stillbirths. Doctors say my wife cannot have child anymore. I need to have at least one child," Bhola said in a matter-of-fact way. "And you think other women will worry a child?" "Yes, for sure. My wife is from here, this area. Most of the women from this area has the same problems. Either they have stillbirths or babies with deformities. I'm marrying someone from a far off place." So this is like his meeting his like old buddy who didn't migrated to the city, and he lives in a like kind of a jungle which is receding now. So this is the last part of the novel, and this is like it doesn't end here, but it ends somewhere after that. So he's realizing slowly, oh, this is something which he has to face. I think we should let Matthias come right now so that he can wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Timilehin and Sushil, for such a wonderful conversation. And as you know, after the reading is always before the reading. So let me invite you to our final event of Literature in the Making during this year's Festival of Hope, which will start in just a couple of minutes. We will finish our part of the festival with Rebecca Hansen-Sreed and Derek Maddern, who will read from and talk about their current translation projects. Thank you all for being with us. Stay safe, speak up and enjoy poetry in all its forms.